My name is Martin Matter with the Witness to War Foundation. It is April 7th, 2025, and we're in Bergenfield, New Jersey. I'm sitting with Mr. Robin Bartlett, Bartlett, who served in Vietnam with the United States Army with the 1st Cavalry Division Airmobile A Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Cavalry Regiment. How you doing today, Robin?
Good.
Glad to hear it. I appreciate you having me out here for this week. It's an honor and pleasure to be here with you. My first question today is, where are you from originally?
Okay, so I was born in Sacramento, California, but I come from a military family. My grandfather went to West Point. My father went to West Point. My brother went to West Point. I turned down an appointment to West Point. Reason being that after 13 elementary and middle schools and 4 high schools, I had had enough of moving around. So although I'm technically from California and I went to college there, didn't spend a lot of time in California.
Well, tell me about the service before you. Any wars, battles that kind of ring out?
What's that again?
Did anyone participate in any wars or battles that?
Well, sure. My grandfather and my father and my brother. My brother served a tour in Vietnam, actually 2 tours.
Before you?
Yep. Well, one before me and one after me. He did not come back.
Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. Your father, World War II?
Yeah, interestingly, he was an engineer, graduate of West Point, and he was with a engineer battalion. He was a civil engineer, and he was assigned to an engineer battalion in Fort Ord, California. They were getting ready to go to North Africa, and all of a sudden, before computers, the Army came down and said, we need an officer who has scientific background, West Point graduate, and speaks Spanish, which he did, to go to Nicaragua. So instead of going to North Africa with his engineer battalion, he went to Nicaragua, and he was the commandant of the Nicaraguan Military Academy. And they promoted him to the rank of brigadier general. And he served the entire World War II as the commandant of the Nicaraguan Military Academy, training soldiers. At the end of World War II, he had been advanced to the rank of major, and the officers didn't need, the Army didn't need high-ranking officers, so they were going to drop him down to first lieutenant. But the Air Force needed civil engineers, especially my father's expertise was concrete, and they wanted engineers to go around and inspect the NATO airfields. So they said, well, if you come with us, we'll make you lieutenant colonel. And he said, where do I buy my uniform? So he spent the rest of his tour, 30 years, in the Air Force, which also meant we were moving around a lot.
No kidding. So you turned down your appointment to West Point. You went to college instead?
Yes. And again, when I went to college, that was the first time I had ever spent more than 3 years in one place. And the Vietnam War was just beginning to escalate at that time. And there was, family tradition of serving in the Army. God forbid I should ever consider the Marine Corps or Navy. I mean, I would have been disowned. You know which side we sat on in the Army-Navy game, right? So the Vietnam War was starting to escalate. I felt an obligation, family obligation, to serve as an officer and in the Army. And so when I graduated in 1967, I was a brilliant student, right? Had a college degree, so I was brilliant. I was a smart ass. And so I kind of thought that I had never really challenged myself. So I said, well, I'm going to choose the most challenging thing I can think of. So I volunteered for infantry, airborne, ranger training, and assignment to the 82nd Airborne Division. And I got everything I asked for, and more.
And you said your brother had gone there before. I assume he came out of West Point and was already in Vietnam while you were in college?
Yes. Okay. First year.
All right.
I kept him out of Vietnam the second tour because you only have one son in Vietnam at a time. So he was in Korea when I was in Vietnam. And then after I came back, he went to second tour in Vietnam.
Who was he serving with?
He was an artillery officer.
So when he came back, did he tell you anything about Vietnam before you graduated?
Yes, his advice was keep your butt down and your head lower. Didn't have a great relationship with my brother. He was much older than I.
Sure. So tell me about the training process you went through when you got into the main army.
So 2 days after graduation, I had everything I owned was in my car. I was driving across the United States, and I checked into the 82nd Airborne Division. I was a leg, meaning not airborne qualified. And my company commander had the foresight to say, well, we're not going to have you in charge of airborne troops as a leg. So he had me do various different things around the company headquarters. He assigned me a report of survey. And this was a soldier who, I think he went AWOL, if I'm not mistaken, and has lost all of his supplies and materials. His footlocker had been broken into, and all of his gear was gone. So an officer needed to do a report of survey for the lost material. And so I read all the regulations. I was there about a month. So I read the regulations, and here I was, this smart-ass guy from college with my degree was in comparative literature. So I was very comfortable in writing. And so I read all the regulations, and I sat down. I interviewed soldiers who were in bunks adjacent to him and took their statements. And I wrote a 25-page report on this soldier's loss of $250 worth of material and equipment. And I turned it into my company commander. He read through the whole thing, smiled, and said, okay, we're going to turn this into the S4. That's the it was a warrant officer in charge of the supplies and equipment. And about 2 days later, the S4 calls me into his office. This was a warrant officer 4, I think. And he said, what in the world? I can't really repeat exactly what he said, but he threw the paper back. He said, this is the kind of report of survey you would write on the loss of a tank, not $250 worth of equipment. Give me 3 paragraphs, call the soldier guilty, and charge him for $250. So that was good learning experience. I learned that less often is more.
Brevity is the soul of war,
yes.
After all. So you said you made it to the 82nd. You're out at Bragg.
Fort Bragg, North Carolina, now called Fort Liberty. So I was there for a month and then received orders sending me down to Fort Benning, Georgia, now called Fort Moore. And
actually, they just changed them both.
I heard they changed it back, which is good because most people call it Fort Benning. So my first course of instruction was the airborne course, jump school, not airborne, but paratroopers course, 4 weeks. Started each day with a 5-mile run and 25 pull-ups. So you had to get your strength up and build up the muscles in your arms. And my favorite story is that on the last day of training, the last course was the parachute malfunction course. No one fell asleep in that course. And then on Sunday at church service, it was standing room only before jump week. So we made, the following week, you made 4 jumps and you earned your paratrooper wings. So now I was really a hot shot because I had my paratrooper wings. And then the next course was the infantry officer's basic course. That was 6 weeks in length. And I went through with the graduating class from West Point, the infantry graduates from West Point. These were, really gung-ho ring knockers. And are you familiar with that term, ring knocker? Ring knockers are the West Pointers who wear their ring, and when they stood at the podium, they would always smack the podium, so that's where the name ring knocker came from. And there was a mild animosity that began between the West Pointers and the Distinguished Military Graduates, which was the ROTC graduates who were DMGs, Distinguished Military Graduates. And that escalated in Ranger School. Because this training for the West Pointers was just old hat. So we graduated from the Infantry Officers Basic Course, and the next day started Ranger School. And of course, you took all your insignia off. There was no rank. We started with about 120 officers and NCOs and graduated about 65. So it was very arduous, demanding training. It was the hardest training, and still to this day, I think it is the toughest training that the Army has to offer.
It's a very big leadership school at the end of the day. Yeah.
Well, not only certainly leadership, no question about it, but they took you to the point of physical and mental exhaustion and hunger, because if you didn't make your patrol, you didn't get your food. I lost 35 pounds in Ranger School. But they took you to that point of exhaustion, and then they said, okay, now you're the leader, take over and lead the patrol. And that was very, very demanding, but I came out of it with a tremendous sense of confidence. To this day, my wife says, your greatest strength is that you are fearless, and your greatest weakness is that you are fearless. So a tremendous amount of confidence, and that held me in very good stead in Vietnam, because there really was not one time in charge of my platoon that I didn't feel in control of the situation. I was plenty afraid, don't get me wrong. I mean, when the bullets are flying, you're afraid. But because of that training, I felt in control, that I felt I could manage the situation. So as I mentioned before, there was this animosity that developed between the West Pointers and the DMGs. And at the end of each of the 3 phases, you had a buddy rating. And most of the soldiers who were in my squad were West Pointers. And all of a sudden, I was getting a bad buddy rating because there were only 2 ROTC guys in the squad. And I said, I'm going to get screwed. So the good news was that I came down with bronchial pneumonia, and I was coughing so much I couldn't go on patrols because I would interrupt, I would create a hazard. So I got recycled. So instead of the course being 9 weeks for me, it was 12. And I had 2 weeks in the second phase, which is the mountain phase.
Yeah, I assume you got the pneumonia in mountain phase.
At the beginning of the mountain phase.
It gets cold up in those North Georgia mountains.
Yep, and this was November. So it was chilly. Well, actually, it was September, but then when I went back, it was November. And but when I came back, I was going through with the artillery class from West Point, and they were not as gung-ho. And plus, I had 2 weeks into the phase, and so I knew somewhat about what was going to go on. So I was ahead of the game, so to speak, and I could tell them, don't volunteer now, but do volunteer then, later. So at the end of each phase, there is a confidence test. At the end of the first phase in Fort Benning, it's the rope drop confidence test. You climb a 35-foot telephone pole, you walk across a plank with 3 steps, you transfer to a diagonal rope, you transfer to a horizontal rope, you go out to, and it's over water. And you touch the ranger tab in the middle of the rope and you let go with one hand. You salute the officer on the dock below and you request permission to negotiate the rope drop confidence test. And you have to say that perfectly. And if you do, then he says, do a pull up and drop. And of course, you have to yell Ranger all the way down into the water. At the end of the second phase is the suspension traverse confidence test. And again, you climb this telephone pole and you're standing on this little tiny platform with two people standing there and they're tied in and you're just standing there, and they hook up it's a zip line, but you're not tied into it. You're just holding on with your hands. So you come zipping down this zip line. There's an officer on the dock with a flag. And when he drops the flag, then you lift your feet, you smack into the water. So that's the second confidence test. The third confidence test takes place at the end of the swamp phase, and that's called the night swamp navigation test. And you and your ranger buddy are dropped off along the edge of a very large swamp at 8 o'clock at night. And you needed to cross the finish line on the other side of the swamp by 6 o'clock in the morning. And they had ranger cadre stationed every couple hundred meters. Now the cadre didn't want to get in the water. They wanted to stay dry. So if they caught you, they sent you back to the starting point. So the trick was to evade the cadre, go into the swamp, maybe up to knee level, waist level.
So yeah, swamp waist level.
And then skirt the swamp. If you had tried to go straight through, you'd never make it. So my ranger buddy and I crossed the finish line well before 6 o'clock the next morning, but there were some who did not. And those soldiers were loaded onto trucks and buses and returned to Fort Benning, and their records showed that they had passed the course, but they were not permitted to wear the ranger tab. That was the final confidence test. And so we had a big celebration at the end. We got food, and we did a running pass and review. And then the platoon sergeant, the ranger platoon sergeant who was in charge of our platoon, pinned the ranger tab on your shoulder. I still have that tab. And it was a very, very proud moment. But as I mentioned before, that was the best insurance policy an officer could have in Vietnam. Then I returned to the 82nd Airborne Division and joined my battalion.
Now, tell me about getting your orders to Vietnam, because things get a little murky here.
So when I joined my battalion, I went in to report to the battalion commander, a lieutenant colonel. And I was sitting outside his office waiting to go in, and there was no S1, that's the personnel officer. And I said to the sergeant who was standing there, I said, where's the S1? Where's the officer? And he said, well, they're all in Vietnam. We don't have any. We need an S1. I said, well, what's the job all about? He said, well, you need to know how to write. I said, well, I know how to write. So I went, he said, well, tell the battalion commander. So I said, I'd like to be the S1. Here, I'm a second lieutenant, right? And that's a captain's job. And so the battalion commander looks at me and says, throws me a pad of paper and a pencil, and he said, I want you to write a memo to the brigade commander and tell him this and this and this, 3 paragraphs, short sentences, short words, do it. So it went back out, sat at the typewriter. He said, have the sergeant show you what the format was, put the piece of paper in, typed up, and brought it back into him. And he takes his pencil and says, I told you, short words, short words. I got the job. So instead of being a platoon leader, I was the adjutant, the S1. And one of my responsibilities was to plan the parties. I was very good at planning parties. And one of the other responsibilities was every month they would call and say the following officers and NCOs are on orders for Vietnam. And I would dutifully copy down the names and where they were going. And then on one day, they said my name. You're going to the 101st Airborne Division. They wanted to keep airborne officers in airborne units. And it just smacked me in the face. And I had to make the sergeant who was giving me the information, go back. I said, wait a second, I stopped about 4 names ago. So they wanted to keep airborne officers in airborne units. So about 30 days, I had some leave, went back home to California. My parents were living in California at the time. Stayed with them, did a lot of running, and got ready to go. And ultimately went to Travis Air Force Base and flew to first to Hawaii and then to Vietnam. I left on May the 9th, 1968, and I came back on May the 9th, 1969, which is very unusual because you never could determine what day you went over, what day you came back. But
now this is like shortly after Tet. What's going through your mind now? It's finally underway. You're heading out that way, and things are getting really hot out there.
Absolutely.
What's going through your mind?
I'm scared shitless. Pardon my French. Second lieutenant, and arrived. I should mention also that because I went over on May the 9th, I came back on May the 9th. My wife was born on May the 9th. My youngest son was born on May the 9th. I have played those numbers in every conceivable combination. I have never won anything. So, but interesting story that was the case. So I got to, did the usual thing. I arrived in Benoit, terrible smell, bus to the replacement depot, mesh work on the windows. Why do you have, you've heard those stories many times. And they said, well, all orders are canceled because of the extensive officer and NCO casualties as a result of the Tet Offensive of January 1968. Stand by, we'll tell you where you're going. So, the heat was just so oppressive. That was the main thing. You took like 3 or 4 showers a day just to stay alive. And 3 days later, I got orders assigning me to the 1st Cav Division. And the good news was that they had more helicopters in the Cav than in all of Vietnam. That was good. We had more helicopter support for reinforcement as well as medevac, and allowed us to carry lighter packs. My pack only weighed 45 pounds compared to other officers in the 82nd or 101st, which they carried 75 pounds. Carried more water, more ammunition, and we flew everywhere. So then I proceeded first to the division rear in Anke, and then the division forward in Camp Evans in I Corps. And they were just building Camp Evans.
Now tell me about coming in as the new guy over there.
Well, there was a 3-day acclimatization period at Camp Evans and refresher training. And because you really had to get used to this 105-degree heat, and sometimes even hotter than that. And after that, then ultimately I was assigned to the 1st Battalion, 5th Cavalry Regiment. And what was your question?
Just coming in as a new
officer. So when I arrived at my battalion, I arrived with 3 other officers. And we were ushered into the battalion commander's bunker at 8 o'clock at night. And this guy Lieutenant Colonel, was dead on his feet. We went in alphabetical order. There were no A's, so I went in first. And he gave us a 2-minute pep talk. I haven't got a clue what he said. And afterwards he said, well, to the S1, where do we need these officers? We need 1 in A, 2 in B, and 1 in C. So he points at me and says, you go to A, 2 to B, 1 to C. I was the only officer to complete his tour. The other 3 officers were either killed or wounded. The life expectancy of a platoon leader at this point in time in Vietnam was 90 days. You were a target for snipers. They shot the guy in front of the radio operator, and then they shot the radio operator. So that was pretty awesome situation. I had been in the Army for 1 year on that day, and I was promoted to first lieutenant after 1 year.
Wow.
That was my introduction. And then I was assigned to A Company. And I had never really had platoon leader's responsibility. So my company commander, in his wisdom, and he was a very smart guy, he was a captain, said, we're just going to make you the mortar platoon leader for a little while. Get your chance to kind of get your feet on the ground, see what's going on. And after a couple of weeks, I started to take more of a leadership position and initiative on doing some things. Had a very exciting time ambushing gazelles with a mortar. And then he said, okay, you're ready. Take over the first platoon. So I took over the first platoon at that time. And I think there were 3 reasons why I survived my tour. Number 1 was I sat down with my platoon sergeant and my squad leaders, and I said, you guys have had more experience at this than I, but I'm still in charge. However, if you see me doing something wrong, I want you to speak up and tell me. And they did, and that was very helpful.
I'd imagine these guys have already been out there for 6-7 months by the time you got there, yeah.
Their tour was a year in the field. My tour was 6 to 7 months, then a staff job. So the second thing I did was I tried very, very hard not to do stupid stuff. And that may sound silly, but it was real easy to do stupid stuff. For example, I had a fellow officer in the 82nd who was calling in a helicopter, landing a helicopter, and you had to give arm signals to the helicopter pilot because they couldn't see exactly where the skids were. And he did so by standing on a mound. And when the helicopter landed, the blades cut off his head. Stupid stuff. And then third was that I listened to my point man and my cover man. Those are the guys 75 meters, 50 to 75 meters out in front in a line formation. And our lives were in their hands. So if they called me forward, well, if there was a booby trap, they'd spot it or they'd hit it. If there was an ambush, they'd spot it or they'd get ambushed. Dangerous positions, the most dangerous positions. So if they called me forward and said, I just don't feel right about what's happening, where we're going. I don't hear any monkeys. I don't hear any birds. There's some sometimes smells. So I would shoot artillery out in front of our position. I shot a lot of artillery. I shot so much artillery that the battery that supported us got to know my call sign, Foggy Day 16, and they put a budget on me of 25 rounds. That's all I could shoot, but that was enough. You put 25 rounds out in front of that gives you a lot of confidence about walking through the area. And a few times, that was this is a tactic called reconnaissance by fire. And a few times that turned out to be a very good thing. So that was kind of my introduction to my platoon. I served in I Corps in the northwest corner of I Corps, next to the Laotian border. 3 canopy jungle, mountainous terrain. So we humped the boonies. Average temperature was about 105. With the humidity, it was awful. It was just, we carried 2 gallons of water and go through it by 1 o'clock in the afternoon.
This is a major NVA hotspot?
Our mission was to prevent infiltration from across the Laotian border by the NVA. And there were it was a free fire zone, so there were no friendlies. If we encountered anyone, we just killed them right away. Didn't ask questions. There were no friendlies in the areas. There were no Montagnards, nothing. You just, for the most part, we were following a lot of animal trails. And there was something called wait a minute vines. Wait a minute vines would hang you up, and you had to cut your way through with machetes, and just, it was brutal terrain for the most part.
Your uniforms just getting torn up the whole time.
Well, we wore the same uniforms for 4 to 6 weeks at a time. Got about 4 days, you got used to the smell. The longest I think I ever went was about 5 weeks. And they finally flew clean clothes out to us. And I got to the clean clothes pile late. So the only pair of pants that was left was a small, and I wore medium. So I had to put those on. And about the 3rd day, I stepped over a log and I ripped out the crotch. And of course, in Vietnam, it's too hot to wear underwear. So in my book, I call that chapter, Letting It All Hang Out.
So speaking of how you came into the country, in your book, you wrote about NCO Roberts.
Right.
Could you tell me about that and your experience with him?
So Roberts was, first of all, my platoon sergeant went through the instant NCO course at Fort Benning, Georgia. So did Roberts. And my platoon sergeant came out as an E6. Roberts came out as an E5. Because my platoon sergeant went in as an E5 and then came out as an E6. So he and I had about the same level of training. He had his 19th birthday in Vietnam. So that's supposed to be the most experienced man in the unit, usually 10 years of experience. So he and I were about the same level of experience. But he was a very good man, very good guy. The troops respected him tremendously, and he gave good advice. Roberts was gung-ho. He had been trained to be, he wanted medals, he wanted to make his kill, and he didn't listen to the men who were experienced. And he carried all this equipment. And the first thing we did was to eliminate all the stuff you didn't need. Fortunately, I had a platoon sergeant, not a different platoon sergeant, who helped me tremendously. Got rid of all this excess stuff that we didn't use, you didn't need to carry. You needed the water, ammo, hand grenades, smoke, star clusters, and minimal other stuff. You know, you had your poncho and your poncho liner, toothbrush, toothpaste.
Could you give an example of something excessive that he was carrying?
He carried all this web gear, and he carried everything that they had issued to him practically. I honestly don't remember, but all I remember is that he was always, and he wore a t-shirt. He was sweating all the time. So we kept saying to him, don't carry, let's get you squared away. You don't need all this stuff. But all he wanted to do was, he was an E5, so he wanted to be a squad leader. And technically he was authorized to be a squad leader because my squad leaders were all Spec 4s. Didn't have any E5s.
While the train's crossing that, the squad leader that you were talking about, what was his name? The one you had a lot of respect for?
My platoon sergeant?
Yeah, that's it.
His name is Compass.
Compass.
He's on the wall. His name is on the wall. He didn't make it back. So anyway, Roberts wanted to be squad leader. And I said, you're an FNG. We're not making you a squad leader until I feel confident that you're ready to take over. Yes, you are authorized by rank to be a squad leader, but right now this Spec 4 has more experience than you do. And he wasn't happy about that. And he kept saluting me. And I said, you don't salute, you don't say sir, and you don't salute an officer. You put me in danger every time you do that. So we were sending out a patrol, and I had one of my squad leaders get ready to go out on the patrol, and Roberts wanted to go. And I asked the squad leader, is it okay if Roberts wants to go? He wants to understudy you and see how you handle the squad. And he said, yes, but as long as he understands that I'm in charge. So I made it very clear to Roberts, this guy's in charge. You're just to take orders like you're a grunt. And they got into contact, and Robert stood up with his hand grenade and charged the sniper, and it put a round right through his head. End of story. So he was my first KIA, and I call that day my first worst day in Vietnam, because the officer's responsibility when you had a KIA was to go through the pockets, make sure there wasn't anything there that shouldn't have been, and wrap the man in the poncho. We had these 3x5 cards. We called them death cards. And you wrote, the information on the card and put down the coordinates, the best you could figure out where he had died. You attach that to the boot with a dog tag, the other dog tag around his neck. Put him on the helicopter, send him home. And it was tough. It was that, as an officer, and none of my men would bring the body back, but they didn't want to have that responsibility of putting them in a poncho. And I carried a ball of twine because when the helicopters came in, there'd be a rotor wash. And I would tie the poncho around the waist and feet and around the top of the head, just so that the poncho wouldn't flap in the rotor wash. That was a hard job. That may have been the second hardest job I had to do.
You're hands-on with,
when an AK-47 round goes through the front of your forehead, it leaves a little tiny hole, but when it exits out the back of your head, it blows big chunks out the back. And that's pretty traumatic for a 22-year-old to have to deal with.
not to mention waiting for the helicopter, that smell,
Well,
the heat.
when they're dead, they're dead. My priority was always the living, or the wounded, I should say. And that's probably why I probably would not have been a great commander. Because if I had a man wounded, depending upon how serious it was, if it was just a minor wound, or if it was not life-threatening, then I would continue the attack. But if it was life-threatening, if he was bleeding to death, it was an amputation, whatever it might have been, whatever the trauma might have been, my priority was to get medevac in, get that guy back to the based hospital. And, Army said that's not your responsibility. Your responsibility is to attack the ambush, attack the enemy. So like I said, I probably would not have been a great commander. That was not my priority. My priority was if it was to help that soldier survive.
What would you say was one of your proudest moments in Vietnam?
I don't really have any proud moments in Vietnam, to be honest with you. I'm thinking about that.
Or maybe a moment where you guys went above and beyond expectations, everything went according to plan. Not that anything ever goes according to plan.
I had some amusing things happen to me,
Sure.
but I did not have, I really didn't have anything, even in my staff position. I can't say that it was a grandiose moment for me. It was crappy.
Yeah. Well, how about amusing?
Couple of amusing things. And you may have heard this story before because I think it's happened to other people too, but we had an FNG and we were at base camp And the FNG's job was to go to the latrine, and the latrine was a 2-holer built up on wood with screening to keep the flies out. And there was a trap door, so you pull out the dirty cans and you push in the clean cans. And we gave him my platoon sergeant gave him very clear and specific instructions. Go to the artillery battery, you get a canister, empty canister, brass canister of a 105, and then you go to the diesel fuel bladder, fill it with diesel fuel, go down, pull out the dirty cans, put in the clean cans, pour half into one can, half in the other can, step back, light match, throw it in, stir, burn it up. That's how you got rid of the excrement. And he followed he said, do you understand? You got very clear? Any questions? Got it. And he followed those instructions perfectly, except that he didn't know the difference between diesel fuel and JP4. JP4 is gasoline for helicopters and whatnot. And so he filled the can with gasoline. And he dutifully poured half in both cans, but he didn't pull them out very far. So when he stood back and lit the match and threw the matches into the can, it exploded. And it set the latrine on fire. So these guys who were in there running out, and of course we're back about 7,500 feet, excrement blown all over the place. And we're laughing, tears coming down my cheeks. And this poor guy had to help the engineers rebuild the latrine, and then he had that duty for the rest of the week, and he was so happy to go back out to the field because he didn't have to do that anymore. Now, you probably heard that story before, because I think it's happened to other people too.
Oh Lord! So, doing a lot of air assaults. Any of those stand out in your mind?
Say that again?
You do a lot of air assaults, I assume. Any of those stand out in your mind?
Helicopter assault? Yeah. Charlie Alphas, what we call them. I made more than 50 helicopter combat assaults. On a couple of occasions, I made twice a day. A few times we were the quick reaction force, and then my platoon was right at the helipad, and we just spent the whole day right there waiting for something to happen. I always rode in the first helicopter when it was my platoon's turn to lead the assault. And then I made sure that I had the most firepower in that helicopter. M60 machine gunner, grenade launcher, squad leader, RTO, ammo bearer, and the lead bird in, or even though we would prep the LZ with 105 and you had Cobra helicopters flying overhead, sometimes they would survive. And they wouldn't shoot down the first helicopter, they'd wait for the second helicopter. And then, they'd try and take it out. And if they did, then it would crash, and whoever was left had to fight it out because they wouldn't bring in more helicopters until it was secure. Usually they'd send them to another LZ, and then those men had to come and reinforce you. But it was the radio operator's job to inform the battalion commander overhead that either the LZ was green or red, hot or cold. So hit a few hot LZs, nothing terrible, more just ambush. I mean, just a sniper. They'd fire a couple of shots, and of course, that was still just as scary. It didn't matter whether it was a big firefight or a little firefight.
Any close calls on one of those hot LZs?
Well, we had sniper fire, but it was fortunately just they hit the helicopter, and you got off that chopper very, very quickly, especially if you started hearing pings off the side. the only really close call I had was my platoon was part of, actually the whole company was part of a blocking force outside a village. And I never had any contact with friendlies, with this, except this one time when we were a blocking force. And then we were way outside the village, and the village was being searched by ARVN soldiers. So we just literally sat there the whole day. We were supposed to prevent anyone from leaving the village, which we did. But as the choppers came in to take us out, there was a ping on the helicopter. So got a shot fired at the helicopter. And of course, the minute that happens, the pilot gets the hell out of there as quickly as possible. So we got up to about 1,500 feet, and the engine stopped. And it's a pretty scary thing, because we all thought we were going to die. And we're starting to come down really, really fast. And while all the lights on the dashboard are flashing, and you're hearing beep, 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 and everybody starts saying their prayers. And the pilot is screaming, I got it, auto rotate. I'm going, what the fuck is auto? I didn't know what auto rotate was. We never heard it. They never trained us about auto rotate. And I'm hanging on for dear life. Everybody else is hanging on for dear life. And we're figuring this is it, because we're going to crash. And we did. But it was a controlled crash. And it spread the skids. And we got out of that helicopter as fast as we could. The other helicopters circled around. Fortunately, we were in an area of kind of open, grassy area. But we had no idea if there were any enemy close by or anything. And it was just one helicopter, with about 8 guys in it, and crew chief, 2 door gunners, pilot, co-pilot. Everybody survived. And they brought in another helicopter, and we all got on that. And they ultimately were able to recover the helicopter. But that was pretty scary. That's as close as I came to being really, really scared. I shouldn't say that. There were a few other times I was really, really scared. That's the time I thought I was going to die. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, you're down there. You weren't planning on being there, but you don't know what's on the other side of that tree line.
Well, not only that, but I mean, I didn't know that a helicopter could do a controlled crash. I just thought we were going to crash, and that was going to be it. And of course, you weren't wearing seatbelts or anything. You were just sitting on the floor of the helicopter. So it was a scary time.
Oh, yeah. How about extractions? Any extractions staying in your mind?
Never had any serious extractions. I had one time when the platoon was on a quick reaction force. And like I said, we would just sit at the helipad the whole day waiting for something to happen. And you knew something was going to happen when the pilot and co-pilot are starting to run out of their little Quonset hut toward the helicopter and get things runned up. And my platoon loaded on the helicopters. We had no idea where we were going. We had no idea what was happening. I had an operations officer come running out to me while the chopper was warming up and said, we've seen an enemy, we've identified a unit, and we're going to helicopter you right in on top of them. Be prepared for a firefight. That was the briefing I got. Not much more. And we did, in fact, go into this landing zone, get the hell off of that chopper just as fast as we possibly could. But I think the enemy knew that we had spotted them, and they went across the border just as fast as they could possibly get out of there. That was their escape route. Even in a battle, they would take their wounded and dead back across the border. We'd see blood trails, we'd see body parts, but often no bodies.
Which a lot of guys today have been talking about the battle for body count, which that makes it very difficult to.
And every battle we had to win. Every battle had to have a body count, and had to be very, very significant body count. We always killed more of them. In fact, I think there were some statistics that indicated that if we had killed as many people in Vietnam that we said we killed, there were more than the population of North Vietnam. So metric, body count was the metric by which officers were measured in Vietnam. And that goes right on down from division, right on down battalion, brigade, battalion, company, platoon.
So I want to talk about getting your staff position. You're out in the field for a few months.
7.
Yeah, you've seen a lot of stuff. You're dealing with a lot of guys. What's it like getting the staff position and getting out of the field? It's got to be difficult to leave your guys out there.
So I'm in the field, and I get a call from my company commander, and he said, there is a helicopter inbound with your replacement on it. You've got 15 minutes. So I had 15 minutes to say goodbye to my men, turn my map and my compass over to my platoon sergeant. This loach comes in, the replacement gets off on one side, I get in on the other side, and takes me back to battalion headquarters, battalion base camp. It's not a very big base camp, but it's a base camp. More secure than certainly out being in the boonies. And I started to understudy the S1. That was my secondary specialty. And on the third day, he came to me and said, did you apply for a job at division headquarters? And I said, no. And he said, well, I have orders here that you're to report for an interview to division headquarters at Camp Evans in I Corps to the 14th MHD. And I said, what's the 14th MHD? He said, get on a helicopter and go find out. That's a nice way of saying it. So I did. I got on the helicopter and I started asking around. Nobody knew where the 14th MHD was. Finally, a soldier said, I think it's down that road about a mile. So I trudged down the road and I came to the 14th Military History Detachment. The motto of this unit was, you fight it, we write it. So the job, well, first of all, I was interviewed by a captain who had gone through all the personnel files of every officer, junior officer in the division. There were only 3 that had either literature or journalism backgrounds. And I look around this tent, because at the time we didn't have Quonset huts, we had tents. And I saw fans and cots with air mattresses. There was a refrigerator with Coke and beer, television set, and off the back there was a shower. I was offered the job and I took it. And my responsibility was to, on a quarterly basis, every battalion had to furnish a after-action report, battle report, and lessons learned. And we needed to consolidate these, type them up, and distribute them Army-wide. We also went to the division briefing every night. And on one occasion, or a couple of occasions, the G3, that's the division operations officer, full colonel, would say, is the representative from the 14th Military History Detachment here? And I'd stand up and say, yes, sir. He said, well, we've just been having this 3-day battle, and I want you to fly out tomorrow and interview the people who are left and write up the report, write up the battle, because we're not clear on what happened. So I did. I got on a helicopter with my sergeant the next day, and the battalion commander wouldn't talk to me. The operations officer wouldn't talk to me. I was a first lieutenant, but the company commander did. And his company of 120 men was basically decimated over a 3-day battle, mostly occurred at night. And out of the 120, he lost 80 killed and wounded. So it basically made his unit no longer an effective fighting force. Had to pull him off the line and re-equip. I spent about 2 hours with him, taking notes, recording what had happened. And when the enemy retreated back across the Laotian border, they took all their dead and wounded. And he said, I know we killed hundreds of them, but no bodies. So I turned in my report to the G3, and he throws it back at me and said, I want you to hold the company commander responsible for the decimation of this company, and put in that we killed 465 enemy soldiers. So I did. I rewrote the battle and, rewrote what happened and held the company commander responsible. But like I said before, body count was the metric by which officers were evaluated.
Well, tell me about coming home from Vietnam, May 9th, was it 69?
69. So I landed. Now, remember, I was a regular Army officer. So I'll just tell you one quick story before that.
Sure.
An officer fills out a form when you're getting ready to come back, and called a dream sheet. And I put in that I'd like to be assigned to the West Coast. So that meant Fort Lewis, Washington, or Fort Ord, California. And I didn't get orders. So I talked my boss into a 3-day trip to Saigon to buy art supplies, because we needed some art supplies, and to find out what my orders were. So after 2 days of sightseeing and eating some very good food, I said, well, I guess I better find out what my orders are. And I went to MACV headquarters, Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, and I was ushered into a gymnasium, an actual gymnasium with the basketball hoops pulled up. And on the floor of this gymnasium were these low wooden trays full of punch cards. This was Fortran computer processing. And every card was a soldier in Vietnam. So we went down the line, A to B to BA to BAR to Bartlett, John, Bartlett, Peter. You're going to Seattle, Washington, Fort Wainwright. And I went, wait a minute. I went to high school in Seattle, Washington. There is no Fort Wainwright in Seattle, Washington. Are you sure it's not Fort Lewis? No, it's right here, APO Seattle. We had to go get a directory and look up that Fort Wainwright is located in Fairbanks, Alaska. So I went from Vietnam to my next duty station in Fairbanks, Alaska. But when I flew back on May the 9th, 1968, we arrived, I think we stopped in Alaska at Eglin Air Force Base, if I'm not mistaken. And then we went on down to Travis Air Force Base. It was 11 o'clock at night, and I was sitting by the window, and I looked out the window, and there was there was like a building, which was the, we had ramps that went down, you got off the airplane, walked across the tarmac to the terminal. And there was a fence around the building. And on the other side of the fence, there were two people standing there, a man and a woman and a dog. And I said, those are my parents. My father was an Air Force colonel, so he was able to kind of get to know some people. And they met every returning flight from Vietnam, because I couldn't tell them when I was going to come back. They met well, first they figured out not to meet the Marine flights, because that was logical. But they met and we were all dressed the same, right? When we got off the plane. And I got as close as I am to you until my mother recognized me. And I kissed her through the fence. And then, we had to go open our bags and that sort of thing. And I said, listen, I have my orders. I know where I'm going. My parents are here, which they couldn't believe, but they were. And so I went with them and never had to experience any of the kind of experiences that a lot of the soldiers had once they went to Oakland Army Terminal and then into San Francisco. My parents drove me to our home in Monterey, and I was there for about 10 days, 2 weeks, getting my car ready to go to Alaska. And so I never really had a negative reintroductory experience from coming back from Vietnam, which was good because I've heard terrible, terrible stories from soldiers who have.
Now, were you looking to maybe make a career out of it?
Oh, yeah. By that point in time, I still was pretty much committed to the Army and was, following in the family tradition. I was a captain by this time. Well, actually, I still was a first lieutenant. When I got to Alaska, they immediately promoted me to captain. 2 years in the Army, and I was a captain. And I was put in charge of a headquarters and headquarters company of a mechanized unit. I knew nothing about vehicles, nothing. So my battalion commander said, well, the first thing you should do is have a complete layout of all the vehicles. Okay. I mean, I had armored personnel carriers. I had 2.5-ton trucks. I had ambulances. I had jeeps. I mean, there were 240 men in my company. And here I am, 24-year-old captain, right? Brand new captain. So I had them all laid out. And I'm walking down the line, feeling very confident, with my 2 bars on my helmet, on my hat. And I come to this ambulance, and it's got a big red tag on the ambulance. Well, I'm going, oh, must be something wrong with this vehicle. And I said to the driver, what's wrong with your ambulance? And he was from the South, deep South. And he says, it hones up. I said, what? He said, it hones up. I had no idea what he said. I said, show me. He looks at me, goes over, opens the door, gets in the vehicle, says, it's the hone, sir. The hone does not work. Might be a little bit racist, but that's the truth of the story.
As a Southerner, you get a pass.
Okay. I was there for about 6 months. We would go out on maneuvers, and within 5 miles, we would lose 50% of our vehicles because we had no parts. We spent all our time trying to keep these vehicles running. They didn't run because all the parts priority was Vietnam. And so finally, in the Army's wisdom, they said, pack them all up and ship them down to the National Guard. And then we issued snowshoes and skis, and we became a light infantry unit. So I was there for 2 years. And then I received orders of transferring me to back to Fort Benning, Georgia, to the career course. So on the way, I decided to stop into the Office of Personnel Operations in Washington, D.C., and see what was the big picture for me. And I met with a major who was an armor officer. And I said, this is very strange. Why is an armor officer counseling an infantry captain? Furthermore, this officer had no combat experience. This is very strange. And he said, well, Captain Bartlett, we have this wonderful tour planned for you. You're going to go to the career course, and then we're going to send you to the Monterey Language Institute, teach you to speak Vietnamese, and send you back to Vietnam as for your second tour as a Vietnamese unit advisor. And I said, it's not exactly what I want to do. I'd like to go to Germany and be a military attaché. He said, well, we could talk about that when you come back from your second tour in Vietnam.
And this is 71, they're talking about 75?
This is, yes, 71.
That's wild, because we were drawing down, they're talking about 75.
This was the big plan. Second tour in Vietnam. And he said, I said, well, wait a minute. There's only one job that's worse than being a platoon leader, and that's being a Vietnamese unit advisor. Some would not agree, but that was my assessment. And they said, well, this is what we have you programmed for. did not like programmed. I said, well, I just soon like not to do that, so I'm going to resign. He said, but you can't resign because you've accepted orders transferring you from Alaska to Georgia. You're obligated for an additional year. And I said, well, I don't want to do that. He said, well, this is what we have you programmed for. And if you refuse to go to the advanced course, we have no recourse but to send you back to Vietnam right now. Take the weekend and think it over. So I did. I called my father. I said, I'm not going to be programmed. Came back Monday morning, met with this officer, and I said, go ahead, reassign me to Vietnam right now, but I want my resignation on file for 365 days from today's date. I figured I got 30 days of leave, 2 weeks of R&R in Vietnam. I could probably get away with only having to spend 8 months, maybe 9 months. And so he says, well, he goes and huddles with 2 other majors, comes back. And he said, let's not be hasty. Here the Army has spent all this money to move you and your family from Alaska to Georgia. Well, I was a bachelor. Everything I owned fit in my car. So clearly he had not looked at my records. But for the first time in my life, I kept my mouth shut. And he said, you could be an instructor or something. They'll find a job for you. And I said, okay. So I went back to Fort Benning, and I was assigned to the leadership department of the infantry school. And that turned out to be a very, very good assignment for me because I was put on a team that developed a course of instruction that was implemented Army-wide. And that sort of launched me into my civilian career, which was in publishing.
Wow. So a couple questions to wrap us up today. What do you want people to remember about Vietnam based on your experience there?
So when the division moved from I Corps down to 3 Corps, because we were very successful in preventing infiltration from across the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos, they moved us down to prevent infiltration across from Cambodia. It's customary to throw out anything that you don't need. And the office that was directly across the road from us was the PIO, the Public Information Office. And I noticed this big pile of photographs and artwork. And I went over there and I said, what are you going to do with this? And they said, we're going to burn it. I said, well, can I have some? He said, help yourself. So I came away with 3 binders of artwork and photographs. And fast forward to 2006, I worked with a friend of mine who was in advertising. And he said, we have to do something to showcase these photos and artwork. And we developed a video called, and while in Vietnam, I wrote an essay called The Trail, which was what it was like to walk point down a trail in combat. And so we used that text and put it to music, photographs, artwork. And once the video was complete, I played it at a meeting of the New York, New Jersey 1st Cav Division, and I brought the original artwork with me. And there was a veteran service officer in the audience. And he said, gee, I think I know the artist that drew this picture. This is the original art. I'm going to put him in touch with you. I said, I was busy. I was talking to other soldiers. We were swapping stories. And about 2 to 3 weeks later, I'm driving out to the University of Scranton to visit my son, and I get a cell phone call. And this guy on the other end says, hi, this is Johnny Johnson. I understand you've used my artwork in your video. And I'm thinking, uh-oh, this guy thinks I've used his art. Well, I mean, I have used his artwork, but I knew that artwork used by a combat photographer or a combat artist taken in combat is in the public domain. But I didn't know if he knew. So I said, well, listen, I'm driving. Let me get off the highway and I'll call you back. And he said, well, wait a second. I haven't seen the video. So I told him where he could see it on YouTube. I get off the highway, get some gas. I call him back. And he says, I'm so proud that you have used my artwork in your video. So we're talking. We swap some stories for about 10, 15 minutes. And at the end of the conversation, he says to me, "Welcome home, brother." And that was the first time that anybody had said welcome home to me in 27 years. So the thing I'd like to have people remember are those code words, welcome home. And very, very meaningful to Vietnam veterans because we were not welcomed home. We were spat upon. We were called baby killers. We refused to wear our uniforms in public. And we hid our military service in our civilian careers. And as Vietnam veterans start to walk in the boots of our Korean and World War II brothers, our ranks are getting thinner. There are fewer and fewer of us. And if someone who's watching this video wants to demonstrate that they understand and empathize with the sacrifice that we made for our fellow soldiers, for our families, for our country, for you, then when they greet a Vietnam veteran, say, welcome home, because it will move us. It's a game changer.
Now, is there any song you heard today that will take you back to your days in Vietnam?
I'm not a big music person, never have been, unfortunately. So I don't have a good answer for that.
No worries. All right, lastly, just any final thoughts, words of advice, timeless wisdom for anybody watching this?
Remember those two code words. I challenge you to remember those code words. Welcome home.
Well, thank you so much again for taking the time to share all these stories with me. It's an honor and a pleasure. Also, do you want to plug your book real quick?
That's my book.
It's a good read. I can vouch for it. Robin, thank you again.
Thanks.
Welcome home. Thanks for
Okay.
your service, sir.